The commercial fur trapping industry simply doesn't have a place anymore.
The world was a way different place in 1890 than it is today.
We romanticize trapping in Canada. Trapping isn't particularly romantic. It's an industry that relies on killing animals.
Literally tens of thousands of unsold pelts every year.
The fur markets are terrible.
Coyote pelts have crashed, lynx pelts have crashed.
That's not a full-time job, that's not a part-time job, that's a hobby.
Trapping is actually the industry that promoted the discovery of Canada by the Europeans. We had a big settlements of people along the Red River in Winnipeg, which at the time was being discussed to become the capital of our country. That's how important the fur industry was. Today, the fur industry has a much less important role.
The world was a way different place in 1890 than it is today. So to say something is historically significant, therefore it gets to stay, we've had a pretty checkered past as people.
So the fur trade has gone through a number of transformations over time. My name's Patricia McCormack, or Pat. I'm trained as an anthropologist at the University of Alberta, and I have a PhD in social cultural anthropology. There's always been a fur trade of some sort by Indigenous people. It was considered a subsistence activity, no more important or less important than, say, hunting big game or fishing. Indigenous trapping was never for profit before the fur traders came. The subsistence component diminished somewhat once you got European intervention. And that led to a commercial fur trade, an industrial fur trade actually, with the arrival of first French traders in the 1700s and then later with Quebecois and English fur traders, most notably the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. The fur trade transformed again in the 20th century with the arrival of many white trappers who were trapping specifically for industrial profit. That was really what led Europeans to expand further and further, because they basically started decimating the furs in the areas where they were trading. They brought things that people wanted, early firearms, metal, which was highly coveted. They brought blankets and cloth and jewelry, brought all sorts of things that were novelties. Didn't necessarily make life better for people, but people wanted them. And once you started trading for firearms, you almost had to keep doing it because everyone had firearms. After World War I, there was a depression in prairie agriculture. And all these homesteaders that the government had encouraged to come west, all these homesteaders now had to go out and find other ways to make a living. Farming wasn't good enough. And so many of them went north to trap. And they didn't go into lands that nobody was using. They went into lands that were being heavily used by Indigenous people. They didn't always know what they were doing. They were total greenhorns, many of them in the bush. And they trapped for money. They were very specifically looking for income to support their families and their homesteads. And they would go into an area, they would displace Indigenous trappers. They would trap everything out in the area and created immense havoc. They were described as mining the land for fur, which is why I call it the very first truly industrial trapping that happened in the North. And that's the way white trappers trapped. It was not subsistence trapping. It was not conservation oriented. Over time, those white trappers wanted to control the areas they were trapping. That was a problem because Native people were guaranteed the right in their treaty to be able to trap. But in the 30s, the government of BC introduced a system of registered trap lines. In the 40s, the government of Alberta introduced a system of registered trap lines that basically divided all those lands into specific areas that you would apply for. Indigenous people objected to the registered trap line system. They had their own ways of spacing people across the land. Governments, neither at the federal level nor the provincial level, paid really much attention to the treaties and what they had actually promised. These weren't necessarily the written texts of the treaties, but the verbal promises or assurances the commissioners had made when they negotiated the treaty. Basically, even if you were a Treaty 8 First Nation and you had a right to trap, if you couldn't get a trap line, one of these registered trap lines, you weren't allowed to trap, which to me is a profound violation of Treaty 8.
There's no grandfather clause on morality. Just because something was accepted in 1890 or 1910 doesn't mean it has to be accepted today. I mean, they're tearing down statues across the continent because their image has been tarnished. There was suffrage so women could vote. Women weren't working or going to post-secondary. There was segregation. We've had a pretty checkered past as people. Why can't we update trapping?
I'm Bruno Gerussi. I'm Canadian. That's Canada out there. Now, this film is not pretty. It's not entertaining. You're not going to like it at all because it's shocking. It's probably going to make you feel sick. But I hope it'll make you feel angry enough to make you want to stand up and insist that as a civilized Canadian, no more will I tolerate this happening in our land. In 1975, the government of British Columbia made a commitment to ban cruel trapping methods by 1978. They didn't do it.
Anyone that cares about human dignity really has to ask the question, how can we go on treating other organisms in such a terrible way? And that comes down then to the question of the kind of trapping we do if we're going to kill and trap animals. Then it seems to me that from the standpoint of human beings, we've got to develop ways that reduce the amount of suffering and cruelty.
Here instead is a snare, which will catch the animal and strangle it as it attempts to pass through. If properly set, the animal may die in 5 to 15 minutes. When it's not caught around the neck, it can suffer for days. After years of industrial development, few Canadians are today wholly dependent on trapping for their livelihood. Many do it only on weekends, as a hobby.
The commercial fur trapping industry simply doesn't have a place anymore.
If you compare the industry to other natural resources, it is not the value that it used to have when we were in the 1700, when it was really the reason why Europeans pursued the development of the exploration of our country.
I mean, we romanticize trapping in Canada. We think of trapping as this romantic tradition that comes down to us and helped build Canada.
My connection to trapping began as a kid watching movies like Jeremiah Johnson and just getting fascinated with the whole idea of being out in the woods and living in a cabin and just living off the land. I've always had this kind of love affair with trappers, and we've got so much in common. We're out in the bush and we love that experience and that life. To me, the only disconnect was really on the killing side of things. I just didn't understand why you had to be out there killing the animals. I understood it in our history, but in today's society, it didn't really make sense to me.
Trapping isn't particularly romantic. It's an industry that relies on killing animals, for which trappers get very little money. The big returns go to the companies that acquire them and then convert them into clothing.
From an economic perspective, it's not a viable industry.
Today, the fur markets are terrible. The fur markets are almost non-existent.
Historically in Canada, trappers sold their pelts through primarily the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. That slowly transitioned over the years to auctions. And there was a number of auction companies throughout Canada that would offer pelts for sale 4 to 6 times a year. Buyers would come from all across the world to buy furs from Canada. Currently, we're down to one auction house. It's the Fur Harvesters Auction. They offer pelts for sale just twice a year. The reason for the drop in pelt sales and prices is very clear. People in North America just aren't buying fur anymore. In fact, most major retailers in North America have canceled all fur completely. Macy's, Nordstrom's, Neiman Marcus, Saks, Armani. Same thing with the designers, Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Hugo Boss, Chanel, Versace, Valentino, Gucci. None of them sell fur anymore. And then if we look here in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company, which historically, they were the foundation of the fur trade in Canada, they no longer sell fur. One of Canada's most notable manufacturers, Canada Goose, an iconic Canadian brand, for years and years sold their coats with real coyote fur on their collars. Due to consumer demand, they made an announcement in 2021 that they would no longer do that, and they now use faux fur. The prices for coyote pelts dropped dramatically from approximately $100 in 2018 to most recently a third of the price, just $29. And in 2023, there was two auctions. The first auction, they offered 45,440 coyote pelts for sale. Just over 27,000 of them actually sold. So that left 18,000 coyote pelts in unsold inventory. The second auction, they offered 41,855 pelts, of which only 10,045 were actually sold. There's literally tens of thousands of unsold pelts every year. It seems like an incredible waste of our wildlife.
I question the future of fur trapping as it used to be. My answer should not be perceived as I'm against fur trapping. It's just that things change, and we see a lot more products that replace fur that do the job. There is a bad stigma with some garments. People's views of things of values change.
The Fur Institute of Canada publishes the number of fur pelts that are collected each year in Canada, along with the value of those pelts. If we look back to 2012-2013, there was 916,572 pelts produced, with a total value of just under $49 million. The numbers 5 years later, in 2016-2017, dropped to 532,000, with a value of just over $18 million. So now we go to 2021-2022, which are the most recent published numbers. And there's 330,077 pelts produced with a value of just $7,833,000. So that represents an 85% reduction in just the last 10 years in the value of pelts produced in Canada. And compare that to the number of trapping licenses that were issued for each of those years, we get some interesting numbers. In 2012-2013, there were 36,181 licenses issued. It works out to $1,300 per trapping license. 2021-2022, there was a similar number of licenses at 35,210. That's just an average of $222 per trapping license. So understanding that perhaps not all licenses are actually being used. So people have a license, but they don't actively trap. Let's take 10% of those. If even 10% of the 35,000 licenses that were issued are actually being used for active trapping, that takes that $222 to $2,222.
A trapper mans a line for 6 months. He's got to have a vehicle to get out there, big truck, snow machine, ATV. He's got to buy the traps. He's got to go out there and do all this work. And at the end of this 6 months, he will have grossed $2,100. That's not an economic impact. That's not a full-time job. That's not a part-time job. That's a hobby.
This type of pricing and demand is really indicative of the market all over North America. So where are these pelts being sold? Primarily, they're being exported. So we need to ask ourselves the question, does it make sense for us to be capturing wild animals in Canada, killing them for their fur, and then exporting it to other countries?
There's 1,632 trap lines in Alberta. Each one pays the Alberta government $40 annually as a trapping fee. So 40 times 1,600, that's the money the Alberta government gets. That wouldn't pay for one full-time employee.
The Fur Institute of Canada receives hundreds of thousands of federal taxpayer dollars to help them operate. So do all of the provincial trapping organizations. They receive provincial funding. The fur farms receive federal and provincial funding from places like Agricultural Canada to try and support them. So they're basically subsidies and funding from our taxpayer dollars that goes into these industries to try and keep them afloat. A few people in the north can still argue that they make a livelihood off of it. The vast majority of trappers, so taking those 2,000 trappers in Alberta, less than 1% would actually be making a full-time livelihood off of it without having to have side jobs or real full-time jobs. That really puts into perspective what this industry is compared to almost everything else. You know, you look at ecotourism or wildlife photography as an example. You know, my own company going out and leading tours to take people to view wolves and polar bears and grizzly bears and all sorts of different stuff. You know, I go do a wolf trip. That's $50,000 going into the economy just from 1 week of being out wolf viewing. You know, a trapper can be out there all winter and kill that entire pack of wolves. And they're going to be lucky if they get $2,000 from all those pelts before their costs come in and get considered. So it really, from an economic perspective, just doesn't make sense anymore.
For Native people, it's still a genuine tradition. It's a cultural tradition. It's not just a livelihood, it's part of a whole way of life to be in the bush, harvesting the resources of the land. And it was genuine harvesting because the people used to manage the land as well. I think the bottom line still is, what are the animals being used for? If they're used for fairly small personal needs, it's subsistence trapping. And that's quite different from industrial trapping, where you're trying to kill as many animals as you can to make as much profit as you can.
I don't think it is my spot to come in and tell Indigenous people whether or not they should be trapping, whether they can make money out of that. That's between Indigenous communities to sort out for themselves. But the commercial fur trapping industry simply doesn't have a place anymore. A wolf pack had been basically wiped out on the edge of Banff National Park, all by one trapper.
There is no management then if you're just going to trap when the pelt prices are up.
There's this saying that trapping is a conservation tool.
Trappers are not wildlife managers.
When has killing an animal ever protected the survivors of that same population?
All you hear about is all the damage wolves do to livestock and big game. It's just not true.
If tomorrow fur trapping was to stop altogether, that won't be the end of the world.
We have written wildlife policies that really don't benefit the wildlife at all.
When they do their review of trapping regulations, they actually require input from the Alberta Trappers Association. So they ask the coyote about the security of the hen house.
What we need to do is see wildlife for the individuals that they are.
Future generations will blame us for our failures to protect the trust. They already blame us.
There's got to be change. We've got to affect change.
We know it can work and we know it can happen. So that's what gives people like me hope when we come into this and we start advocating for change.